I was unloading the last of the feed from the pallet when Jonas wandered out from the shade of the corrugated steel storehouse. He paused in the heat for a moment and spared an appraising glance up to the clear noontime sky, his lean frame, weathered face, and bushy mustache once again making me think of old Western movies. The trusty wheel gun on his hip and its well-worn, hand-tooled holster did its part for the whole look. I saw his focus shift to the distance and knew his sharp eyes hadn't missed the thin gray line of clouds on the horizon. There'd likely be rain by late afternoon, I thought, but it wasn't like we didn't need it. Pastures were a little drier than we would have preferred, but that was to be expected in late summer under the Texas sky. He raised a hand in greeting and walked over, wordlessly helping me throw the last rough bag of sweet feed onto the trailer. For a man getting on in his years, his muscles were still as strong as steel cables, and he never shied away from volunteering his back to help someone if he could. I grabbed a couple of water bottles from the cooler in the back of the side-by-side, double-checking the trailer hitch to make sure it was secured as I passed by it. Coming around the back of the trailer, I sat on the edge and offered a water bottle to Jonas. "Where have you been?" I asked, wiping the sweat from my eyes with a dusty forearm. I cracked open the water bottle and drank deep, relishing the icy cold of it. Jonas shook his head a bit, leaning against the trailer beside me. "Been looking for Lucas. You haven't seen him, have you?" "Not today," I said. I didn't know Lucas Evans very well, but from what I did know, I got the impression that he was really trying to make a go of it here. A good kid who'd gotten in with the wrong sort of folks back in Kansas and ended up at the short end of the stick. The way I figure it, everyone's entitled to a few screw-ups in their lives, especially when they're young. It's a measure of a man how he deals with it and whether he's willing to clean up his own mess. It seemed to me that Lucas was in the middle of doing just that. As if on cue, the two-way radio on my belt crackled to life with the familiar voice of Jeff Mickelson, one of the repair crew bosses.
"David, you copy?"
I grabbed the radio and keyed the mic.
"This is David,"
I replied.
"What can I do for you, Jeff?"
"Jonas with you?"
I handed the radio to Jonas and took another drink from the cool water. Jonas spoke into the radio.
"Hey, Jeff. You got Jonas. What's going on?"
"Heard you was looking for Lucas Evans. That right?"
"Yep, sure enough. You seen him?"
There was a bit of a pause before Jeff answered.
"No, but some of the boys said he was talking in the bunkhouse a couple nights ago about that old train trestle down on the South 40. No idea if he went down there, but there's a four-wheeler missing and ain't nobody seen him since yesterday. Figured you might want to know."
A dark shadow crossed over Jonas's face at that, and he turned his eyes to the empty pastures to the south, where the tall green grass of the rolling fields rose to meet the rocky hills that served as the southern border of Mr. Kirkman's land.
"You sure about that?"
He asked into the radio.
"I didn't hear myself, but Charlie Richards and Butch Johnson both did,"
came the reply. I could hear something in Jeff's tone, something unsaid, but something Jonas clearly understood. Jonas scowled, a mixture of frustration and concern. "Damn it, boy," he cursed, almost to himself. He cast a quick look at me before keying the radio again. I knew that something was wrong. Something more than Lucas just going AWOL.
"Appreciate it, Jeff. Do me a favor. Let Colton know we're going to run down and take a look, will you? I don't want him getting all worked up about the kid until there's something to get worked up about."
Colton Hatch was the ranch foreman, a good man who'd taken Lucas under his wing and damn near adopted the kid.
"Sure thing, Jonas. You two be careful now."
"Trouble?" I asked, accepting the radio back from the old cowboy and hopping down from my seat on the trailer's edge. He had a faraway look, maybe for a second. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He gave a tight nod. "Maybe. Hell, probably. Why don't you go get your gun and meet me over at the Jeep? I got a bad feeling. Let's just hope I'm wrong." I knew better than to waste time asking for an explanation. There'd be plenty of time for that before we got wherever we were going. So I just nodded and headed back towards a shadowed storehouse to grab my things. 20 minutes later, we were driving along the disused and mostly overgrown dirt road that cut across the southern pastures like a scar. Jonas drove in silence, his brow drawn low and his hands clenching the steering wheel just a bit tighter than normal. I watched the tall grass whip by as we rode along. my thoughts drifting a bit. The sun was hot, but under the canvas top of the Jeep, the wind felt cool and pleasant. With a grazing rotation schedule, the southern pastures were empty of cattle right now as the forage plants were recovering, though I expected we'd be moving them back within a couple months, giving the eastern paddocks a break for a bit. For now, it felt for all the world like we were the only living things for miles. The small cluster of buildings where I'd spent my morning had shrunk to black dots in the side mirror of the Jeep, further obscured by the brown haze of dust that trailed our passage on the dirt road. Ahead, the land became more uneven and hilly, the rolling fields gaining clusters of green trees and brush. The dirt road led us in a straight line through the steel gate in the fence and beyond, towards a welcome embrace of the piney woods. Before too long, we found ourselves out of the high sun and in the cool shade of the trees. The road here was less traveled and less defined than in the fields, and Jonas slowed our pace to accommodate the jogs and curves of the soft forest road. We pulled to a stop a couple times, and the old man hopped out to examine the sandy path ahead for fresh tracks. The set of his eyes when we got rolling again told me he'd found evidence of recent travel. I guess that the tracks likely matched our missing four-wheeler. At least we were on the right path, wherever that was leading us. Another 15 minutes driving in silence, and we broke free of the trees and out into an overgrown swath of farmland, gone to seed and long forgotten. I wasn't sure whether we were still on Mr. Kirkman's property, but I suspected that nobody would care about our presence here either way. Looked like nobody'd been here for a long time. The dirt road ended at the edge of the field, and I could still make out the barely defined patterns of plowed earth between what Mother Nature had taken back. Across a field a few hundred yards, before the trees started again, I could see the collapsed remains of an outbuilding of some sort. Not large enough for a proper barn, but maybe a shed or a small bunkhouse. Beyond that, nestled into the edge of the tree line, was what looked like the remnants of a modest farmhouse. The crumbling fieldstone hearth and chimney the only things left standing amidst the splintered fragments of timber. Jonas put the Jeep into four-wheel drive, and we started across the uneven remains of the field, the suspension bouncing and creaking as we went. My eyes swept across the broad field, settling on the rusting skeleton of an old tractor, just left out in the middle, as if waiting for its master to return and pick up where it left off. Weeds grew out from underneath the engine cover and the seat, swaying gently in the breeze, and it was leaning a bit to one side in the forgotten soil. Jonas saw me take notice of the tractor as he turned the wheels in that general direction. "That's a sad story," he replied to my unasked question. "This land used to be owned and worked by a farmer named Jack Williams back in the 70s. Wasn't a big farm, probably only 100 acres, I suppose, but it was enough. He had a little boy that used to run around with the farmhands as they worked the area. He was probably 7 or 8 at the time. Little tow-headed kid who was always tagging along with them like a damn mascot." He paused the Jeep as we came alongside the old tractor, the faded blue paint almost nearly lost to the reddish-brown rust that had claimed it. The big tires were completely rotted away, leaving the thing sitting on its steel wheels as it slowly succumbed to the weather and the years, now completely sunk to its rotting frame in the grassy field. The little kid was riding along in the tractor one day, same as he always did, when it bucked over a rock or chuck hole or some such. Wouldn't have been an issue, but on that day, the little boy lost his balance, fell off the tractor and went under the wheels. He was killed almost instantly, which I suppose is a small mercy if such a thing exists here. Weren't nobody's fault as I understand it. Just a freak accident. Jonas ducked his hat in respect towards the thing before putting the Jeep back in gear and getting us on our way again. The loss of the old boy was too much for Jack's wife, whose heart gave out in the middle of her kitchen a month after that. Doctor said she was likely dead before she hit the floor. Old Jack followed them both a year later with the service pistol he'd brought back from Korea. Damn shame. The Kirkmans ended up buying the land at auction after the bank foreclosed and just let it sit like it is right now. Sort of memorial, I guess. I nodded absently, head turning to watch the husk of the tractor as it fell behind us, standing alone once again in the middle of that field. Old Leon Martin, well, he was gone before you got here, so you didn't know him. He used to come out here every year on the same day and leave a teddy bear or some little toy on that tractor. Never asked him outright why he did it, but I do know he worked for Jack Williams when the accident happened, so I got my theory. Old Leon ended up drinking himself into the grave back in 2010 or so. A touch of a scowl crossed Jonas's face, just for a tick, then it was gone. I swear, seems like there ain't a blade of grass around these parts that hasn't seen its share of tragedy and loss. Whole damn place seems cursed sometimes. We reached the other side of the field and turned west along its border, the land rising a bit as we moved into the rolling hills. The trees thinned as we continued, and the ground migrated to dirt and rock beneath our tires. As we cleared the last of the pines, I saw what had to be our destination. We found ourselves in a shallow valley between two low, rocky peaks. The floor of it was covered in splotchy tufts of bright green grass, interspersed with rocks and hard-packed dirt. A dry riverbed split the two hills, and an old weathered train trestle spanned the gap between them. The bridge looked every bit of 100 years old or more, the timber gray and tinder dry. More than a little of the bracing was missing entirely, the cast-off beams splintered and littering the ground below, leaving unsettling gaps in the support of the bridge. Wasn't exactly sure what was still holding it together, as much as it had fallen to disrepair. What I was sure of was that there was no way it would bear the weight of an engine ever again, let alone an entire train. This thing was long since done for, abandoned and left to rot like the farm we'd passed. We drove closer, Jonas carefully navigating the rock fall and uneven ground of the shallow gorge, and I saw the two hungry black voids of the tunnel entrances carved into the rock faces on either side of the trestle, looking somehow more menacing than they had the right to be. The Jeep slowed to a halt about 100 yards from the trestle foundation, and I craned my neck out of the window to gaze up 75 feet to the tracks above. Never actually seen one of these things in real life before. Seemed a lot bigger than I'd imagined. "Dead Creek Trestle," Jonas supplied, leaning close over the steering wheel to gaze out of the dusty windshield at it. Great, I thought, wishing for once that something out here would have a name like Pretty Pony Bridge or Dandelion Creek or something like that. Hell, I'd have even settled for Unicorn Fart Gorge at this point. Jonas must have seen the look in my eyes, because he cracked a grin and said, "It's just the name of the creek, David. It was called that long before the damn idiots decided to dig holes where they shouldn't have." He pulled up a bit closer, shutting the Jeep off, and got out, closing the door behind him. I followed suit, walking around the front while still staring up at the lattice work of the trestle in wonder. Felt like a silly thing, being so stunned by a wooden bridge, but there was something about it that just held my attention. Jonas nodded at the thing. "Oh, back in 1910, the Marshall and East Texas Railway decided they were going to connect the line up from Harleton down to another that ran to Houston. That line took them right through here. They figured it was a good idea to dig through the mountains instead of going around them, I guess. Took them 5 years and a lot of blood to do it. But on October 8th, 1915, they were open for business," Jonas said, grabbing a canvas pack from the Jeep and slinging it over his shoulder. He motioned towards the hill on our left and started making his way up the gentle slope. I reached into the back seat and snagged my canteen before heading after him. "You know," he continued over his shoulder, "same as a lot of places around here. This particular rise is one that's had nothing but black clouds attached to it over the years. Oh, nothing as colorful as what you might find in some of the other sites like Gravestand or Harper's Hope, but bad nonetheless. Just quieter about it. Caddo Indians called it the Hill of Black Whispering and gave it a wide berth. They say that on a quiet night, the grounds around here come alive with the voices of the dead, rising up from under your feet." Jonas looked back at me with a tight grin. "But they say a lot of things, I suppose." We climbed a bit further, focusing on our footing amidst the loose scree underfoot during our ascent. When we were about halfway up the slope, I paused and turned, catching my breath and taking in the view of the valley and the fields below. From here, I could just make out the distant form of the tractor that killed the Williams boy, sitting all alone in the middle of that broad field. Shifting my focus, I looked over the woods to the northeast and saw the vast tree-dotted pastures of the Double K Ranch stretching out as far as I could see. Seemed like it covered half the world from up here. I was turning back to continue my climb when a flash of blue caught my attention from down below, on the other side of the trestle, just visible through the gaps in the timber frame. It was a four-wheeler, parked at the base of the hill. "Jonas," I said, catching his attention and directing it towards the ATV. "Well, shit," he replied with a sour look. "Just get Colton on the line and let him know we found Lucas's ride," he said. "See if he can spare a few fellows to come up and help us find him." I nodded and unclipped the two-way from my belt, changing channels and keying the mic.
"Colton, this is David Riggs. You copy?"
I heard nothing but static in response. I tried again, but with no better luck. There might have been something like a voice mixed in with all that noise, but if there was, it was too faint to be of any use to us. Looking back to Jonas, I shrugged. Guess we're too far out. Jonas lingered a moment, working something in his head. I could see he was torn, and I figured he was trying to decide what to do, whether we were better off heading back to gather up some more folks or just go looking for Lucas ourselves now that we knew for sure he was out here somewhere. He didn't even need to say anything before I resumed my climb. I knew the old man pretty well. There was no chance he was going to leave that Evans kid out here any longer than necessary, especially if we were already here. We'd at least check it out a bit before heading back for more help. He offered me what I thought was a grateful nod and fell in beside me. "You're a good man, David," he said, almost too low for me to hear. I kept the smile from my lips and instead asked, "So what happened when they opened the line? Got a feeling that the story doesn't end with a big party down in Houston." "Nope, sure enough. Well, the entire construction of the tunnel was plagued with mishap from the onset. Something like 15 or 20 men died digging it and laying the track through. That was an unusual high number even back then. The troubles had already cost the railway a lot of money, and they were just about on their heels by the time it was finally completed." Jonas sidestepped a rock the size of a man's head and continued. "On the afternoon of October 8th, 1915, the passenger train made the inaugural trip down from Harlton on their way to join up with the Houston line. Everything was finally starting to look up for the rail company until that train crossed the Dead Creek Trestle and entered the southern tunnel. Wasn't more than a few seconds after the caboose cleared the trestle and disappeared into the tunnel that workers heard what they described as a hellish rumbling and groaning from somewhere in the depths of all that rock, like they'd woken something up in all that darkness. Said they could feel the vibrations in their boots, even those men watching from down in the valley. Shook my head. Hell, that doesn't sound good. What happened? The old man shrugged. Nobody knows. Train never punched out the other side of the hill. There was nothing but silence after that. More than 40 souls, not including the engineer and crew, just vanished into the black heart of this rock. They waited almost an hour before they sent a team of volunteers in to see what had happened. He fixed me with a sideways look. After another hour, 9 more names were added to the list of the missing. I took a swallow from my canteen and wiped away the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. What do you mean? Search party went missing too? Jonas ducked his head. That's the story. Well, they tried to rally up another team to go in the tunnel and investigate, but I suppose there weren't too many volunteers that time around. There were a couple of U.S. Marshals down from Mount Pleasant the next day who took it upon themselves to deputize a few folks and lead them into the tunnel. They were all puffed up and duty-bound to find that lost train and the other party that had gone in before them. Well, it was a full day later that one of the marshals came staggering out of the mouth of that tunnel, half dead and delirious. He was covered head to toe with cuts and scrapes like he'd just run through a plate glass window. His clothes were shredded and soaked in his blood. He was missing an eye, and the other one was wide and wild. Not really seeing anything, though, if you take my meaning. We were nearly at the top now. I could see clearly the gaping maw of a tunnel entrance just ahead and above us. Saw the way the daylight seemed unable to penetrate as far into the shadows as it should have. Jonas continued. Marshall, don't know his name, was gathered up and rushed off by the railroad bosses who were here. Said they needed to get him medical attention, but I think that was only part of the reason they were so anxious to steal him away. I think they wanted to know what he'd seen, what he'd found. I think they didn't really want whatever he had to say to make its way to the public ear. I don't think they realized that the final nail had already been driven into their coffin at that point. We finally reached the top of the slope and took a moment to catch our breath on the platform of dry rotted planking at the edge of the trestle. "So what happened? What do you have to say?" I asked. Jonas just shook his head. "No idea. Apparently he didn't survive the coach back to town. The railroad men signed sworn testimonies that he'd only mumbled fevered nonsense along the way. Of course, 2 of them resigned the next day without explanation, so figured that maybe there's more to it than they wanted to admit. Well, the Marshall and East Texas Railway Company went under not too long after, buried under lawsuits and bankrupted by the construction of this line." He fell silent a moment, taking in the view. "If they were keeping any secrets, I reckon they died with the railroad." I looked across the rotting carcass of the trestle to the other side, where it emerged from the tunnel in the opposite peak. I followed the rails with my eyes back across to where we stood, an uncomfortable feeling settling in my bones. I could almost hear the rumble of steel wheels making their way along the rusting tracks. Up here, high above the floor of the valley, the wind made a hollow whistling sound as it blew through the timber framework. Occasionally, the trestle made an ominous groaning sound that made me wonder how much longer it'd be standing. I could almost see it swaying and vibrating in the breeze. If I came back next year, would I just find a jagged and twisted pile of wood and steel at the bottom of the gully? I turned to look at the rocky tunnel entrance on our side, swallowing up the rails only a dozen yards to my left. That black maw made me feel uneasy, like I was standing in front of the mouth of some living thing. Maybe something that was only pretending to be a tunnel, just waiting to snap its jaws shut on a couple of unwary prey. Why the hell would Lucas come up here anyway? I wondered aloud, forcibly taking my eyes from that black hole long enough to look up at the gathering gray clouds just beyond the hill. The air was heavy, and I felt the temperature drop that carried in on the wind. It smelled like rain, and probably soon. I hoped we'd be done here and on our way back to the ranch by the time the first drops fell. I didn't look forward to climbing down that rocky slope in a storm, that's for sure. Jonas stepped up next to me, narrowed eyes fixed on the tunnel. Same reason that kid from Georgia went missing up in Gravestand, I suppose. Heard one too many stories about shit goes on out here and didn't pay any mind to the warnings. I looked back at the rocky passage, more than 20 feet tall and just about as wide, blanketed in deep shadows that swallowed up every bit of it. The steel rails, red with decades of rust, ran right into the black heart of the earth and disappeared. It was just being swallowed. Jonas dropped the canvas bag to the ground at his side and took a half step towards the opening, his boots echoing hollow on the dry wood of the platform. "Lucas?" he shouted into that blackness. "Lucas Evans, you in there?" Nothing. Jonas flicked his eyes to me for a second, almost like he was making sure I was still with him. We both stood motionless, ears straining to make out even the faintest hint of a response. But all we heard was the rustle of the grass and the breeze playing over the trestle, maybe the distant roll of thunder. "What do we do here, Jonas?" I asked, my gaze hard on that black entrance, like I wasn't comfortable taking my eyes off of it. I found it strange that I couldn't see any daylight from the other end of the tunnel. Shouldn't have been more than 3/4 of a mile at the most before it reached the other side of the mountain. But I didn't see so much as a pinprick, though. Wondered if maybe there'd been a collapse. That would have explained what happened to the train, I thought, why I couldn't see the light from the other side. Didn't explain the missing search parties, though. Or that marshal that came stumbling back out all bloody and missing an eye. I looked over my shoulder at the other tunnel in the far end of the trestle. Just as expected, I could see the distant glint of sunlight through that dark entrance. It was just a tunnel, just a hole drilled through the mountain, nothing more. But not this one. This one was just black. Didn't feel right. After a beat, Jonas narrowed his eyes and took a deep breath, almost resigning himself to what I knew he was going to say next. "I reckon we ought to take a look," he grunted, crouching down next to his pack and fishing out a couple flashlights from it. He stood with a grunt and shouldered the pack, handing me one of the lights. "He's been up here since yesterday. He might have gotten himself hurt or trapped." I nodded. "If that's the case, he'll be needing our help, and likely sooner the better. I'm with you." Before we went in, I figured I'd try the radio one last time. I switched over to the general frequency that broadcast to everyone on the ranch and keyed it up.
This is David Riggs for anyone on this channel. How copy?
Nothing. Not that I expected anything different.
If anyone can hear me, me and Jonas are down at the Dead Creek Trestle. We found the missing four-wheeler and we're heading in to take a look for Lucas Evans. If you're reading me, let Colton Hatch know that we could use some hands up here to help.
I hung the radio back on my belt and met Jonas's eyes for a second. Even if we can't hear them, that doesn't mean they can't hear us, right? Figure it doesn't hurt, I said. Jonas nodded and, without another word, led us into the tunnel. I knew it would be dark inside, but I didn't count on just how quickly the light from the sun was lost. By the time we'd followed the old tracks 50 feet in, the tunnel entrance was nothing more than a dim nightlight behind us. I was glad that Jonas thought to bring the flashlights. We'd have been shit out of luck without them. The air inside the tunnel was damp and cool, but not refreshing. Like this whole thing, it felt wrong, out of place. When I touched the rocky wall, I was surprised to see my fingers come back wet from condensation, but also a little slick, like I'd touched a thin coating of old grease. The flashlights did their job, though I think we'd have been better off with a couple of lanterns instead. The beams from the LEDs were focused and bright, casting harsh spotlights wherever we pointed them, but not doing much to illuminate the rest of the place. I found that I could diffuse the light some by aiming the beam at the ceiling of the tunnel right above us. It was a little better, and gave us a little bit of ambient light to work with. Didn't do much to make me feel better, though. 100 feet in, the tunnel kicked a slight curve to the right, which I figured also accounted for not being able to see the other end. Soon, even the faint archway of light behind us was gone and we were in complete darkness. Even with the flashlights, it felt suffocating. The farther in we pushed, the more it felt like we didn't belong here. Like maybe nobody did. It started feeling close, even though the tunnel was wide and tall, and I became painfully aware of the thousands of tons of rock hanging right over our heads, pressing down on us. It didn't help my nerves any when Jonas pointed his light at a boulder the size of a yearling calf that had fallen onto the tracks at some point. "Watch your step," was all he said in a low voice, passing it on the right. Another 10 minutes of steady walking, my eyes scanning the tunnel as we went. Sounds of our footsteps had begun to change, the echoes growing shorter, less hollow, like we were coming up on something in the dark. The air had grown cooler still, almost chilly, like what I imagined a hospital morgue might feel like. A place for the dead. Maybe a place we didn't belong. And then we saw it, creeping out from the shadows in front of us like some colossal and terrible thing rising up from the murky depths of the sea. I couldn't see Jonas's face, but I figured it was probably twisted in the same confusion as my own. We swept the beams of our lights across the rusted steel and rotted wood of the caboose, standing silent and cold on the tracks ahead of us. It seemed massive and out of place, standing there in front of us in the dark, impossible and silent, like it was holding its breath. I looked over to Jonas, but he only shook his head, his brow drawn together above eyes that were trying to understand what they were seeing. "What the hell, Jonas?" was all I could manage. "Wish I knew, David," he said, moving closer to the train car. His flashlight wandered over the aged surface and empty windows, casting harsh and disquieting shadows as it moved. He reached out and touched the painted wood, cautious, like he wasn't sure whether it would suddenly lurch out and bite him. I moved a few steps off the tracks to the left, shining my light down the side of the car and farther into the darkness. Ahead of the caboose, a line of lonely passenger coaches disappeared into the muddy shadows, their glassless windows hollow and black along their length. I could see the faded letters, pale yellow bordering on sickly, bearing the initials M&ET rail. I glanced back at the old man, pulling himself up onto the rear steps of the cupola with a creaking of wood that echoed a bit behind us. We met eyes for a second before he entered the darkened rail car. Turning back, I moved along the side of the caboose, the thing towering over me and making me feel trapped between it and the tunnel wall. Other than the scars of time and humid air, it looked in good condition overall, like something you'd see in a museum. The wheels and trucks underneath were covered in light rust, but otherwise looked perfectly serviceable. The heavy coil springs maybe sagged a bit more than they might have when they were fresh, but the whole thing looked like it could start rolling again at any moment. I reached the front of the caboose and moved on a bit farther to the passenger cars. "See anything?" I called back to Jonas as I kept my feet moving, occasionally pausing to shine my light under the train or into an empty coach window. It felt like I was walking through a cemetery at midnight. And I didn't like it, not one bit. I could hear Jonas's footsteps on the wooden planks as he made his way slowly through the caboose, each one deliberate and careful. I could see his light moving from window to window with his passage, sweeping all around. He emerged from the darkened interior and onto the front step of the car, throwing a quick eye over his shoulder like maybe he just heard something behind him. He looked back at me and shook his head. "Nothing," he said, dropping back down to the tunnel floor again. "Tools, supplies, that sort of stuff, but otherwise nothing. It's like they just stopped the train and left." A quiet and almost stealthy sound reached us from deeper in the tunnel. Something an unhelpful whisper in my mind told me sounded a hell of a lot like the scuff of a leather sole against dry wood. Both of our flashlights shifted in that direction at the same instant, but we didn't see anything but the line of cars snaking off into the abyss. The atmosphere of the tunnel felt thick and black, heavy, the damp air clinging to every surface with a slick moisture that didn't feel right. I found myself scrubbing my palm down the front of my jeans, though what I was trying to wipe off I couldn't say. Every ounce of my good sense was telling me to turn tail and get my ass out of there, but I was rooted, still trying to figure it out. The whole place felt like a tomb, but corrupted somehow. It's like stumbling through catacombs or maybe some underground mausoleum that had been defiled, desecrated. An unholy place, a place where the dead no longer found peace or rest. "Lucas?" Jonas called, his voice strong and sharp. "Lucas Evans, that you, boy? It's Jonas and David. Call out if you're able." Quiet echo was the only response that came from that black passageway. Felt like something was there, just out of the reach of our lights, maybe watching us right then. The wind and the echoes mingled together funny in the dark, twisting and turning until they reached your ears as something different, something that tried to convince you that what you were hearing was maybe the whisperings of things that shouldn't still draw breath, voices not meant for the ears of the living. I didn't like it one bit and said as much. Jonas just nodded but didn't say anything. He looked uncertain, anxious, and that alone worried me more than anything else. Another sound. This one might have been from one of the coach cars ahead of us. Not too far away, though. Closer than before. I heard Jonas's wheel gun clear its holster at the same time I pulled my own pistol, though neither of us raised them. As much as I wanted to turn and haul ass out of there, I knew neither of us would be able to sleep if there was a chance we were leaving the Evans kid by himself here in this damn hole all alone. I caught Jonas's shadowed eyes for a moment, wordless determination passing between us, and then I mounted the steps for the passenger car beside us. Jonas was right behind me, something for which I was exceedingly grateful. The doorway to the coach was just an empty rectangle, and through it my flashlight played over dozens of empty seats waiting for passengers that would never come. Steeling myself, I pushed my steps forward, flashlight sweeping as I went. It took all I had not to keep my gun up in front of me. The last thing I wanted was for Lucas Evans to surprise me and accidentally get shot in the process. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight and felt almost spongy, like we were walking through the maw of some living thing. I worried that each step might find me crashing through, likely with a broken leg to show for it. Even though there was no glass in the windows, the air was stale and old with a foul taste to it. I pushed on through the car, feeling at any moment like some horror from the shadows was suddenly going to leap out in front of us. We reached the head of the carriage and stepped across the gap into the next. I didn't miss the scatterings of personal effects half hidden under the rows of seating or the moldering luggage tucked here and there as we passed through. Whatever had happened to the passengers seemed like they left in a hurry and without a care for their belongings. I expected the same for the next car. Hell, honestly, I expected the same for the entire train. That's not what happened. When I stepped across the gap and into the next passenger coach, my feet rooted themselves so abruptly that I almost tripped over and went sprawling. My mouth dropped open and I hitched a breath, though I have no idea what was going to come out, whether it be words or maybe a surprised grunt. Hell, maybe a full-blown scream. Thankfully, before I had the chance to do any of that, Jonas's hand clapped itself over my mouth, pulling me back a step from the force of it. My eyes were wide. I figured the old man's were probably the same. In the car before us, illuminated in stark light and shadows from our flashlights, sat a nightmare diorama. I still have a hard time putting words to it, but I'll try. A dozen or more of the train's passengers sat upright and stone still in their seats, each facing forward and unmoving. They didn't have the look of corpses to them. There was no way they could be alive. That was impossible. Even from the rear of the car, I recognized the early 20th century clothing. The bowler hats, wool jackets, long-sleeve traveling dresses for the women. Though now it was all moldy and rotten, and with more than 100 years of the damp air of this tunnel having worked away at it. Men and women, old and young, kept to their seats, their clouded and sightless eyes fixed wide open, like marbles in the parchment-thin flesh of their slack faces. Their skin was a strange whitish-gray color, with splotches of darker areas mixed in. The smell was almost like an old bookstore or antique shop, age and dust and things long forgotten. At first, my mind refused to accept that I was looking at the long dead bodies of these passengers. I've seen dead bodies before. They don't just sit upright like that, and definitely not for more than a century. These things should have long since turned to nothing more than piles of bone and the wasted remnants of what they'd been wearing. But here they were, waiting patiently in the darkness and silence of this hole for God knows what. Maybe us. Jonas eased past me in the doorway, flashlight held before him like some sort of ward against whatever was going on in here. He held his gun in his other hand, muzzle turned to the ceiling of the car, but at the ready. I didn't understand what he was doing. We needed to get the hell out of here now. Felt like those things sitting in the seats would rise up at any second and surge over us like some fetid and unholy wave of decomposing flesh. But they didn't. They didn't move at all, even when Jonas came abreast of one of them and shone his bright light onto their lifeless faces. I finally got my feet to motion and eased forward to stand near Jonas, my face twisted up in revulsion as I looked upon this fresh horror. Despite the disgust I felt, I couldn't help but lean close to get a better look at the woman seated on my left. I couldn't tell her age, but from her clothing I got the impression she'd been near middle years and perhaps a bit on the plump side. A fancy wide-brimmed hat lay on the floor at her feet, and her brittle auburn hair was shot through with streaks of gray. Her hands rested on her knees, withered and aged and mottled, but somehow purposeful and expectant. Her eyes were wide and dead, almost completely turned to milky white, but still there, as impossible as that was. There was something else, something I couldn't have noticed had I not gotten within kissing distance to this abomination. I could discern the faintest emotion from this woman. It wasn't anything more than an almost undetectable swaying, but it was there. Living things aren't dead and can't take on the perfect stillness of the grave no matter how they might try. Whatever these things were, they weren't corpses. At least, not anymore. I turned my head to Jonas, who'd been looking much the same way at the man seated in the next row forward, wearing shirt sleeves and a waistcoat. We locked eyes for a moment, neither of us knowing what to say. And when I looked back at the woman, she blinked. "Son of a bitch!" I barked before I could stop myself, lurching back from her with such force that I nearly fell backward into the waiting laps of the passengers across the aisle. My ill-advised cry reverberated through the car and echoed deep into the black tunnel around us. My eyes went wide and I froze, fearful of what I might have just done, of what I might have just awakened. We held our breath for a long count, eyes wide and watching for any sign of movement from our hosts. But nothing stirred. The bodies of the men and women remained still as the grave, oblivious to our presence. I could hear my heart beating in my ears before I dared release my breath. Jonas let out a breath of his own and motioned for me to follow him as he pushed forward through the coach, each step deliberate and careful, eyes never ceasing their watchful scanning of the bodies around us, keen for any sign of rousing. We made our way to the head of the carriage, and I took one last look behind us. Those damned eyes. From where I stood, it looked like every set of them were now fixed right on me with their blind gazes. The faces were ghoulish and unnatural, each one, and the air felt pregnant and with menace. For all the world, it felt like they were just waiting for us to turn our backs on them before they came to life, like something out of a goddamn horror movie. Forcing myself to turn away, I followed Jonas into the next car, where we were met with another godforsaken scene right out of Revelations. At the end of the aisle, past all those seated corpses, stood one dressed in the tattered remains of what looked like a conductor's uniform. It was covered in grime and decay just like the others. For all the world looked like the man had frozen in place while he stood at the head of the coach, watching over his passengers like they were his congregation. We waited a long tick to make sure he wasn't moving before Jonas motioned me onward. I didn't want to move, but I sure as hell wasn't going to part ways with the old man, so I followed, trying to keep my eyes on everything at once. When we reached the decomposing form of the conductor, we eased around it as carefully as we could, making sure not to touch it or disturb it in any way. It had the same milky blind eyes as the rest, but I didn't want to wait and see if this one blinked. Somehow I knew it likely would, and I didn't need to see that again. We finally got clear of that car and through the doorway where Jonas pulled up short, tilting his head to the side a bit. I froze and strained my ears, listening intently for whatever he'd picked up on. I heard it immediately. The muffled, panicked sounds of terror, of someone trying desperately to escape or hide, maybe. Ragged breathing mixed in with a quiet whimpering. It was coming from the next car ahead of us and sounded like a man who was barely keeping his sanity from cracking. Sounded about right from what I'd seen so far. Keeping our steps light and guns at the ready, Jonas and I stepped across the gap between the rail cars and into what looked like a freight car. It was open and had no seating and was stacked with crates and trunks, some split open and spilling their contents like a rotten tomato dropped onto concrete. We located the source of the sound immediately. On the far side of the car stood what looked like a narrow cell made of floor-to-ceiling iron bars that might have been used to secure valuables or maybe transport a prisoner or something. Beyond the closed door of the makeshift cell lay a man, curled into a fetal position and sobbing quietly. I didn't see his face, but I recognized the old Harley t-shirt I'd seen Lucas wear on multiple occasions. Jonas rushed forward, with me close on his heels. We reached the closed door and the old man crouched down next to it, light fixed on the boy. "Lucas," he hissed, trying to keep his voice as low as he could. "Lucas Evans. It's Jonas from the ranch. We're here to get you back home, boy." If Lucas heard him, he gave no indication of it. He just lay there rocking back and forth, head covered with his arms. I could see the fresh gouges and cuts on his skin, like he'd been mauled by a mountain lion and left to bleed out. Streaks and the wet sheen of blood, old and new, covered his exposed skin and shredded shirt and jeans. It looked bad enough that I was worried if we'd even get him out of there in one piece. I could see parts of his exposed skin had a strange gray splotchiness to it, like what you'd see in pictures of men with frostbite. But this was East Texas in the middle of summer. That wasn't likely. Jonas stood and pulled on the door, but it was latched, banging against the striker plate louder than I would have liked. I threw an anxious look over my shoulder, expecting at any moment to find the doorway completely blocked by all those sightless corpses. But the doorway was empty, and I turned back to find Jonas reaching between the bars of the cell, hand grasping at an old-fashioned key lying next to Lucas. He must have locked himself in, I thought. I shuddered at the realization that what he must have seen as his salvation had turned instead into the prospect of a slow death behind those bars. But it was the why that was worrying me now. Why had Lucas locked himself in? What was he trying to ward off? Those damned corpses so far seemed content to just remain where they died. But was that the truth? Or just what we'd seen so far? The clanking of the lock and the screeching of the cell door drew my attention back to Jonas. He'd swung open the door and was now trying to pull Lucas from where he lay. I rushed over to give him a hand. It took both of us, but we yanked Lucas out, and when we did, he started screaming like the devil was yanking him down to the fiery pit. Jonas shook him, trying to bring him to his senses, and even gave him a good smack across the face, but the boy just collapsed, his brain deciding that it was probably for the best to shut down for a while. And now we heard the sound that froze the blood in my veins. The sounds of movement. The sounds of shoes scraping across wood. The rustling of moldy and decomposing fabric. The stretching and sliding of desiccated flesh over old bones and tendons never meant to move again. Maybe the sickly draw of breath into lifeless lungs that hadn't felt air in decades. A terrible thought washed over me at that moment, that maybe those things had just been waiting for us to do what they couldn't, to get the boy out from where they couldn't get to him. And now they had all three of us. I felt sick at the thought because it meant a sort of cunning and predatory patience, if not outright intelligence. That realization was more terrifying than I wanted to admit. "Come on, David, help me with him. We gotta move," Jonas said, yanking me back to the here and now, and we took Lucas's arms over our shoulders and hauled him to his feet between us, all 200 pounds of dead weight. Looking back through the doorway, we knew right away that there was no escape in that direction. Strange and half-heard whispers floated through the stale air of the train cars, seeming to come from all directions at once. I shone my flashlight through the doorway and saw to my horror a mass of those things that ought to be long dead filling the aisle and moving with a single purpose towards us. Jonas gestured to the sliding cargo door on the side of the car, and I grabbed the lever with all my might, using every ounce of muscle I'd gained over my years of labor to pull that heavy door open on rusted rollers. As soon as it came open, I saw immediately that it wasn't the salvation we'd hoped. Right outside the now open hatchway stood the decaying remains of a half-dozen men dressed in the rough work clothing of rail workers, each of them looking upon us with those milky white eyes and gaping mouths. You could feel the hunger bleeding off of them, some unholy longing or desire. There was no understanding to it, just an instinctive knowing that if they got their hands on us, we'd be done for. And death seemed like the best we could hope for given the circumstances. Like as not, we might end up as yet 3 more passengers on this damn train, just waiting for the next unwitting victim to stumble into this cursed tunnel. Ain't no way I was going to let that happen, not while I still had breath in my lungs. My gun came up at the same time Jonas's did while we jumped down to the rocky floor of the tunnel, like we were of one mind. We dropped Jonas when we landed, but we had more pressing things to focus on at the moment. Jonas's .357 and my SIG roared in the confines of the rail tunnel, deafeningly loud. The bullets found their marks, punching black and weeping holes into the unnatural things. They just kept coming. No indication that they felt any of them. Jonas stopped to reload while I kept pulling the trigger, wondering how we were going to get past them. And then the first one fell abruptly and without warning, dropping like a rotten sack of bones and meat to the floor. The second one got even closer before it collapsed, spilling across the stony ground with a nauseating squelching sound. The third one had nearly reached me when my pistol ran dry, the slide locking back. Its emaciated hands snaked out and grabbed my wrist, the sudden and intense burning pain ripping a cry from my throat and loosing the pistol from my numb fingers. Jonas's Smith & Wesson appeared in my peripheral vision and fired right into the thing's death mask face. It shut down like a light switch, but its iron grip on my wrist pulled me down to the ground with it, still burning with an otherworldly pain I can't quite put to words. I hit my head hard against the edge of something when I fell, knocking me senseless. Before I knew what was happening, hell, before I'd even managed to yank my wrist free, Jonas reached down and grabbed my arm, pulling me out from under that stinking thing. I felt something wet across my hands and face and down the front of my shirt, but I didn't dwell on it too much. There were still others to worry about. Jonas brought his gun back up and started shooting again. I looked around but couldn't find my pistol, so instead I grabbed Lucas and pulled him up from the ground, hefting him over my shoulder in a fireman's carry. I shouted to Jonas to get moving, and we ran as fast as my legs could move with the extra weight. It wasn't more than a handful of steps before Jonas stopped shooting. I guess he was out of ammo at that point. and I heard him give out a cry of pain. His footsteps were still next to mine as we ran, so I didn't dare pause long enough to see what had happened. The only things I focused on now were keeping one foot in front of the other, and those sounds from the darkness behind us. Sounds of the dead, or at least those things that were supposed to be dead. It wasn't long before I knew I'd never make it all the way back with Lucas over my shoulders, so I let Jonas give me a hand with him, and we carried him between the two of us as fast as we could. And we ran, or as near as we could with our burden. Every step became agony as our muscles were pushed to their limits and beyond, burning and weakening as we rushed back along the tracks. But every time I stumbled or felt like I might fall, Jonas was always there urging me on, shouting at me to keep moving, to not give up. Hell, even in that state of body and mind, the last thing I wanted was to let the old man down. So I pushed beyond what my body was willing to give, and we kept moving. The sounds of those unholy things, those eternal and cursed dwellers of this black passageway, were always right behind us, and they seemed to be gaining on us. Those whispered voices pursued us and surrounded us like a foul wind, filling my ears with their rancid words and trying to worm their way into my thoughts. When we finally rounded the last curve of the tunnel and saw that blinding daylight of the entrance ahead, we redoubled our efforts. Our ragged breaths and staggering steps threatening to spill us to the ground at any moment. Those things were right on our heels now. There was no way we were going to make it. We could barely keep up the pathetic pace we'd slowed to at this point, stumbling along and dragging Luke's body between us. I doubted we had more than another few dozen steps left in us. I could almost feel them on the back of my neck, 100 years dead but somehow still alive. But we were so close now. My eyes were fixed on the ground in front of my feet, making sure I didn't trip over a loose stone or railroad tie. Even so, I could feel the fresh air now, hear the whistling of the breeze through the wooden latticework of the trestle ahead of us, just a bit further. And that's when I heard the shout, strong and gruff and commanding. "Down!" the voice cried, and I dropped to the ground without thought. I had no idea who it was, but I didn't need any encouragement. My muscles were just waiting for an excuse to give out, and now they had it. When I went down, Lucas and Jonas came with me, the three of us tumbling in a tangle on the rocky floor. I felt my foot catch and twist painfully as I went, but I was too tired and spent to have much of a care about that. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. I thought we were goners, but that's when the thunder came again, this time deeper and louder. The shadows that moved over us as we lay on the hard stone floor of the rail tunnel were numerous and indistinct, but I recognized the sound of a shotgun when I heard it, and I heard a lot of it now. I looked up from where I lay to see the broad-shouldered and black-bearded figure of Colton Hatch, our foreman, standing over me, working the Mossberg 12-gauge as fast as it would run. Other men I recognized were crowding the tunnel alongside him, pushing forward with shotguns of their own. Colton spared a glance down at me, and I saw the shadow of worry cross his face. "You're going to be okay, David. Just stay put. We got you now." It was then I felt the throbbing at the back of my skull, and when I reached back with my hand, it came away bloody and wet. Too wet. Too much blood. I looked over at Jonas and Lucas, both of whom were lying nearby. Lucas seemed catatonic as before, but it was Jonas I was focused on. His weathered face had gone pale, and his eyes were wide with the twitches of pain at their corners. His breathing was labored, and his skin was glistening with a sheen of sweat. Something was wrong. I tried to push myself up and get to him, but as soon as I moved, the world swam and my vision clouded, turning gray and dark. I felt my head pulsing in time with my heartbeat, and the sounds of gunfire in the rail tunnel sounded like they were underwater. Blood ran down into my eyes. Then the world went black. I woke up 2 days later in a hospital room, my head bandaged and with a splitting headache. My mouth was dry and my throat was raw. There was an IV taped to the back of my hand and some beeping monitor attached to sensors stuck to my chest. My right wrist was wrapped with thick layers of gauze and hurt like a son of a bitch, like I'd held it over an open fire. The first thing I took note of when I opened my eyes was Colton Hatch sitting in a chair by the window, thumbing through some old dog-eared novel. My stirring drew his attention, and he set the book down, rising and wandering over to my bedside. "It's good to see you awake, David. he said, pushing a grin through his bushy beard. How you feeling, son? Like stirred shit, I thought, but I didn't say that. I'm fine, Colton. What about Jonas and Lucas? Lucas is okay. Cuts and bruises, but he wasn't as banged up as he looked. Doctors let him out this morning. He's back at the ranch now, he said. You know, it was a pretty dumbass move, two you idiots heading in there by yourself. Wasn't for the fact that Cherry picked up your last message before you went in. Would have been a lot longer before we showed up with the cavalry. He straightened and raised an eyebrow. Of course, if you'd waited, there's no telling what would have happened to Lucas, so I guess we're all pretty thankful that neither one of you are any smarter than you are, he said with a rare smile. I didn't miss the fact that he didn't mention the old man. What about Jonas? Colton ran a hand through his coal-black hair and took a breath before answering. He's still here, still on this side of the grave. He'll be here another couple weeks at least. Doc said he had a heart attack, pretty good one from the sound of it, which isn't too much of a surprise considering what you boys went through. He's not exactly a young pup anymore, you know. They figure he'll be all right, but I don't expect he's going to be breaking horses anytime soon. I closed my eyes and nodded, flooded with relief that my friend was still amongst the living. I wasn't quite ready to let go of the old man just yet. The trestle? I asked. Colton looked over his shoulder for a moment to make sure nobody was within earshot. Well, I figured it was best we didn't tempt any other greenhorns to go exploring where they don't belong. I had the boys dynamite the entrances and seal the tunnel that same night. Nothing to worry about now. What about those things? They're still in there. His eyes hardened a bit, and he gave me a meaningful look and shook his head. There's nothing in there except an empty train tunnel, David. Got it? Even if there was anything, it's probably not something we'd talk about here anyways, is it? That sounds like family business. I nodded again, drawing a deep breath and laying back against the pillow carefully. Yeah, you're right. That's probably for the best. He patted me on the shoulder and gave me a wink. Docs want to keep you here for another week, but I'll have one of the boys come pick you up when you're released. In the meantime, just get some rest. Fractured skull, concussion, bleeding on the brain, not to mention that burn on your arm that they swear looks a hell of a lot like frostbite. Same as those they found on Lucas and across Jonas's chest. It doesn't even count the broken ankle you picked up at some point, probably when you fell. You got done up pretty good, David. But you'll pull through just fine, I reckon. I opened my mouth to say something, but he picked up his worn black Stetson from the side table and set it on his head, reaching for the door. You tell me all about it later, he said, giving me a quick nod as he left, the door swinging shut behind him. I closed my eyes and tried not to remember for just a little while.